Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's Conspiracy Theory Thursday on honestly provocative talk for the United States of America. It is my pleasure to be with you. Just how many suspected terrorists do you think are slipping through the cracks under the incompetent Biden administration? And no, I'm not talking there about Hunter Biden and his stash of cocaine at the White House, although I do have a few things to say about that and about some new information that we learned today. It's also made our Twitter poll question today. You'll want to stick around for that. But glad to have you with me on a Thursday. If you want to jump into what we call the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every single weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you happen to be a naysayer, you disagree with my point of view or the argument I'm trying to make, I'd be glad to hear from you. We've been putting naysayers to the head of the line for the last 26 and a half years, and we're glad to put you there as well. As long as you come equipped with a good, solid argument, maybe the ability to answer a few questions, a fact or two doesn't help. Maybe knowing what the law says, those kinds of things. But they're easy things. If I can do them, you can certainly do them. At 866-439-5277. You can send emails to talk@larslarson.com. Tried to make that handle as easy to handle as you could. And then, of course, you can vote in our Twitter poll. That's another way to take part. I'm going to tell you the new information about Hunter Biden and his stash of cocaine at the White House in just a moment. First, the question: who do you think is more likely responsible for the cocaine found at the White House over the Independence Day weekend? We talked about it on the show yesterday. We've offered you a few choices: a staffer, a tourist, Hunter Biden, or the big guy. Vote for anybody you care. You already know my theory. Hunter Biden is the most likely suspect. And I've heard from some of you who've emailed me and said, Lars, you have no proof that Hunter Biden is behind all that blow. No, I absolutely have no proof of it. But you see, you can look at the information that we've been offered up. Cocaine found in a very secure part of the White House, a White House that offered up a phony baloney excuse yesterday that they've already had to back away from. They said, why, it was found in this area where the working staff put things in their locker. No, it wasn't. It was found in a much more secure area. It's a lower level area where the vice president's limousine is parked. Now, I guess I could entertain, and maybe we should have put up a fifth opportunity, put Kamala Harris on that list as well, because there are times when Kamala starts laughing uncontrollably at something that's not funny, and you think, it sure looks like she's on drugs. But I think the odds are that it's Hunter Biden. As I understand, speaking of odds makers, apparently the odds makers in Las Vegas have already said that Hunter Biden is the likely choice for the guilty party when it comes to the cocaine that was found at the White House over the weekend. And why is that important? I know that some of you are going to say, this is just a big distraction from more important things. Fact is, the Biden administration offers up distractions to beat the band. I mean, you've got a war going on, hundreds of billions of dollars going away, allegations of multi-million-dollar bribes to both Vice President Joe Biden, maybe even to President Biden as well. You've got all the major law enforcement agencies that have had to work overtime and bend over backwards to make sure that Hunter Biden and his dad are not implicated. And then you've got a guy who's an admitted drug addict, Hunter Biden, kicked out of the Navy Reserve on his first day on base, having been sworn in by his dad at the White House when he was vice president. He goes to the base, and he ends up getting kicked the first day because they said, here's the urinalysis cup, fill it up, Hunter. And he filled it up, and they pushed him out the door. And you know what? I want to remind you of something about the racist Biden family. I mean, we've gone over the racist bigotry of Joe Biden going back 50 years during his political career. Even his current vice president accused him of being a blatant bigot right there on a debate stage before she dropped out of the presidential race and got the number 2 job as the affirmative action hire for vice president. But she even said that Joe Biden is racist. Do you know, I saw a detail today that I hadn't thought about in years. A guy wrote a piece about Hunter Biden for the New Yorker. Not normally my kind of reading, but I do read it occasionally. It's about a bunch of left-wing garbage most of the time. But this piece was about the theory that if Joe Biden ran for president, so it was before the campaign in 2019, would Hunter Biden be a liability? Was he going to be the albatross or the boat anchor for the big guy? And the article went into great detail about how Hunter Biden used cocaine and got caught. Do you know that he tried to tell the Navy, and if you don't believe me, I'll show you the link to the information. He tried to tell the Navy that he had stopped at a bar for a couple of drinks and he bummed a cigarette off a man from South Africa, probably a black man, because that seemed to be the implication of the comment. He blamed a black guy, said he must have given me a cigarette that was laced with cocaine. And when Hunter Biden got his lawyer on board, a guy who agreed to represent him pro bono, which means for free. I think Hunter Biden gets a lot of stuff for free, frankly. That his lawyer said, no, your history of drug abuse and drug treatment and rehab and all that, that argument that I got it from a cigarette that a black guy gave me at a bar, that ain't going to fly, Hunter. And they didn't do that. But it did turn up in the New Yorker piece. So who do you think's responsible for the cocaine found at the White House? I would say Hunter Biden, but you can vote for one of the others. Maybe we'll even put Kamala's name up there because it was apparently found in a cubby where people left their cell phones as they were either exiting or entering the vice president's limousine. I don't know. Could be Kamala, I guess. I think it's most likely Hunter. It's brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined a long time ago. You can join too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better for you and better for America. Let's go to Anthony, who's my first naysayer of the day. Anthony, welcome to the program. We love naysayers. What do you and I disagree about?
Well, I was about to be a naysayer until you mentioned her name as well. I was actually going to the mind of Kamala Harris for that copy.
Because she does laugh at inopportune times, doesn't she?
Indeed. And on top of that, it's like, who has the most access to that area since she parks over there? Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris, she could be it. And I don't know. Do you think there are times when she's been giving a speech and all of a sudden, out of the blue, for no reason whatsoever, nobody has said anything funny, including her, and all of a sudden she just starts laughing uncontrollably as though something is funny, but we don't know what it is, that could be drug-induced behavior?
As well as the fact on how often she trails off thought, just like Joe Biden does at times.
Yeah, where you kind of rhetorically wander around in circles like you're trying to make. She's told to talk about something and she just keeps repeating herself like some kid in sixth grade who's been told to stand up and give a speech about the Civil War. And he starts by saying, the Civil War was very civil. and then they had a war between the two sides and it was uncivil. You know, that kind of speech that I'm sure all of us have either heard or given.
And I'm sure because she and Hunter may have that in common, they're probably doing coke parties on top of that.
Well, they could be. I guess it's a theory anyway. It's Thursday. It's Conspiracy Theory Thursday. Coming up in a moment, Meta's Twitter copycat called Threads has already got 30 million users in 24 hours. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And as with most media, I mean, when I got into radio and got into television, it was basically talking to a mic or talking to a camera. And these days, media is a whole lot more than that. It's all the other social media wrapped around it, including a presence, as we have, on Twitter, on Getter, on Truth, on Facebook. You know, I'm not crazy about Facebook or the politics of Zuckerberg, but whatever. And now, Meta, the parent company of both Instagram and Facebook, has a brand new outlet called Threads. It's been there for 24 hours and already has 30 million users. The question is Threads going to be a Twitter killer since both Zuckerberg and Musk seem to be at war in all kinds of ways, including maybe even a cage match at some point. Will Reinhardt joins me now, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity. Will, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me. The cage match, all of this is so crazy.
Well, it is. Did you catch the thing? It wasn't Independence Day weekend. It was the previous weekend when somebody had started some suggestion that they were going to have a cage match or a fight of some kind in the Roman Colosseum. And And I thought, well, okay, crazier thing. I don't know that I would disbelieve it, but apparently the Coliseum said nobody had actually contacted them about using the venue. But hey, put that on pay-per-view and you could probably pay off the national debt. What should we make of this new thing called Threads? And is it just Twitter on Instagram? Is that what it is, or what it amounts to?
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like Twitter on Instagram. But I mean, let's step back for a second and think about what Twitter is here. I mean, Twitter is this, this idea of a micro blogging service, right? At least that's the idea, is something short that you do quick, kind of almost broadcast-like responses, and that it hits a lot of different people all at once. So there's kind of a structure to Twitter that a lot of other companies have tried. A lot of other companies ended up failing. And now we're seeing Facebook's effort at this. It's kind of odd to me that we're seeing now a version of Twitter coming, it's now almost, it's getting almost 2 decades since Twitter was founded. And yet this is the first time that Facebook has found it fit to actually get into this space. So to me, I think that really what Zuckerberg sees here is this potential for Twitter to be on the downslide. There's a lot of people leaving the platform. The advertisers seem to be leaving the platform. There's a lot of tension. Costs are mounting for Elon Musk. So I think, to me, I really read this as a competitive move to try to at least hammer home some of the nearest competitors to Facebook and Instagram, which really is Twitter.
Well, let me give you a couple of reactions to that, and you tell me what you think. In some ways, I kind of like Twitter. Even when it was 140 characters, I got the blue check, so I can do a bit more than that. But it forces a discipline on you as a writer. And I've always considered myself a writer first, working in radio, TV, or wherever, that it forces you to really focus in on what do I want to get said. And I only have this many characters. It's actually a good exercise. I mean, even if you like to write long form, to say, can you say that in 280 characters? Well, yeah, I think I can. And it becomes tougher, but maybe you get a better refined product. The second thing I wonder about is, are people leaving because of politics? Or are people, because it would seem that if Twitter was a great place to put ads and sell things before Musk took over, why isn't it, with just as many followers, just as good a place to sell things, which is what advertising does now?
Yeah. I mean, these platforms are incredibly powerful to sell items. A lot of advertisers have left because of Musk, and there is probably a clear politics to that. That is the thing, that when you do get involved in these companies and you're, advertising, for better or worse, that is at least one of your, one of the people that you have to respond to. And I think that Elon Musk has been provocative. He's pushed back on a lot of advertisers. But, the other thing that you have to do is that when you're building your advertising base, as Facebook has and as Google has, you have to open up advertising offices throughout the United States and sell local ads to local people, because that's really what drives a lot of the traffic and advertising. We haven't seen Twitter do that. They have been pulling back, at least from my understanding, on all of their, all the people that sell advertising. So when you pull back that administrative function, right? If you pull back that management function, you're not going to be getting new people coming into the platform. And I think that's a really, really big key component of all of this. And the other thing you said about structure, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, tell me.
Yeah. So structuring, you're exactly right. I think that structuring the platform is so key about structuring very short messages. And I really do love Twitter for all of its problems. I've met some very interesting folks on there. There's a lot of really interesting content. It brings together all of these different groups. And to me, I find it a very useful resource, but I filter everything. There's certain congressional members I do not follow, and people that I mute. So I'm very active on how I use the platform, which I don't think is the case for everyone.
See, I tend to be kind of broad. I mean, I follow people I disagree with. I follow people I agree with. I like to see the whole mix. And actually, it tells something, I guess, about yourself. If you've got people saying, yeah, I won't follow Donald Trump, why not? I mean, he says interesting things. I mean, well, I can't look at that because I disagree with it. I said, so you only read books by authors you agree with? You only want to hear one perspective? Wow, that sounds amazingly tolerant, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, and I mean, partly I'm going to get that because of all the other media that I'm reading, right, or all of the other things. So, and I think this is the case for a lot of people. You might be on Twitter, you might have very specific audiences whereas you're listening or you're going online or watching, news in various different ways. And to me, that's what's unique about these platforms is you can kind of, you can go onto Truth Social and you can figure out the specific audiences that you want to engage with, or you can go on Telegram and figure out the specific audiences that you want to engage with. And to me, I think that's a key part of making this very useful for you. There are downsides that sometimes you don't hear of, information that could be unique or interesting or important in your life. But at least to me, I find that it's going to hit me anyway. So regardless of whether or not I'm filtering it out, I'm going to hear the most important things regardless.
Okay, so tell me this. I'm talking to Will Reinhardt, by the way, from the Center for Growth and Opportunity, is because I haven't had a chance to try it out yet. It's only been 24 hours. Is there anything about Threads that's dramatically different from Twitter, while it's also very much like Twitter? Anything that stands out?
Not really. It feels very similar to Twitter. A lot of the functionality is very, very similar between the two. I think the big thing that we're going to have to wait for is the design is it seems like it may be there, but it just doesn't exactly feel correct. So to me, it looks and feels very similar to Twitter in probably all the most important ways. And I think that's kind of the point, right? They're trying to have something that's very similar to Twitter, but it's a similar sort of field that exists in a lot of other platforms as well, including, Blue Sky and Mastodon, and a lot of these other platforms kind of have this very specific micro-blogging field.
Well, because the other thing that occurs to me is if you say, well, these are tech giants. They know how to do this. I said, well, if tech giants always succeeded, Microsoft would have been successful with a phone. And I think, how many tries have they made at a cell phone? And you think cell phones, once the technology's there, it should be relatively easy for a big tech company to come out with a successful cell phone. Microsoft, not so very much.
I think that's exactly the point. That you can have a lot of emphasis behind it. And another great example was Google Plus, which was a network that existed that had countless people, and it was supposed to be the Facebook killer, and it never really took off. So I'm pretty skeptical. I think that Threads, it has a really, really big uphill battle that it's going to try to win users and win content. Maybe it's going to be a little bit more open and a little bit less content driven or content moderation driven than traditional Facebook has been. We're going to see. I think it's going to be a very interesting 6 months to a year to see actually how things shake out on this platform and the kind of content that ends up coming through the networks.
Well, I want to see whether or not Zuckerberg's politics pollute the environment of Twitter. The minute conservatives start getting knocked out of there, they're going to show themselves, a giant echo chamber full of liberals, just what we needed. That's Will Reinhardt. Will is with he's with the Center for Growth and Opportunity. He's always a great guest. Thank you, Will. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show on what we like to call Conspiracy Theory Thursday, because a couple of decades ago, we noticed that we heard about a lot of conspiracy theories on Thursdays. Your calls are welcome at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Dozens of whales and dolphins have been stranded and killed. And do you know who folks are pointing the finger at? They're pointing at Joe Biden's offshore wind farms. But instead of halting development, Joe's apparently decided to double down and create the largest single wind farm development in New Jersey. I want to tell you about that, but first, if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. And we welcome naysayers as well. You go right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and you can vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find it on Twitter and also on our website. You don't just have to go to Twitter, but at Lars Larson Show on Twitter. Who do you think is responsible for the cocaine found at the White House over the Independence Day weekend? We've offered you 4 choices, although we realized in retrospect there should have been a 5th. Kamala Harris should have been on there as well. But we've offered you a staffer, a tourist, Hunter Biden, the big guy, or perhaps Kamala Harris as well. Who do you think's responsible? I would vote for Hunter Biden. After all, as people have pointed out, make yourself a list of everybody you know who has access to the White House and you know for a fact is a drug addict. You say, well, there's Hunter Biden, and then there's, I'm not sure who else. But Do I think Hunter Biden is the most likely suspect? Absolutely. Now, yesterday I asked you this. Should immigrants to America, I'm not talking illegal aliens, I'm talking legitimate immigrants to this country who have come here, obtained a green card, gone through the process. They've now spent 5 years working in America because a green card gives you the ability to work at a job. You've paid your own bills. You've showed that you're not going to become, as they say in the law, a public charge. That means you're not going to be on welfare, food stamps, and all that garbage. Should immigrants prove they can speak English proficiently in order to become an American citizen? I pointed out that yesterday there was a story out saying that they're going to change the process. At the end of those 5 years with a green card, you are allowed to apply to become a full American citizen. There is a test involved. And usually they judge your English proficiency by simply having the person who asks you about the questions you've answered on the questionnaire. Are you married? What's your wife's name? How many kids do you have? I mean, a lot of pedestrian, plain, ordinary questions. They judge your proficiency based on that. The Immigration Service wants to up that just a bit. They want to have an actual test where they show you pictures of things. Somebody doing something. That's a dog. That's a cat. That man is building a house. And see how well you speak English. I said that's a good idea. 81% of you agreed and voted yes. 19% of you voted no. And I'd love to have that naysayer call me up and tell me why would you say no to that idea. If you want to become an American, if you really want to be part of the melting pot that America should be, always was, and could be again, you have to be able to speak the language. I told a friend of mine, I've never had any inclination to want to move to a foreign country. But if I move to Mexico or Germany or France or Sweden, go back to my roots in Sweden, I'd learn the language. And in 5 years, for sure, you could guarantee that I would learn the language. I mean, if you're going to stay there, learn how to speak the language. The problem is our country is getting carved up into these little teeny communities. In almost any big city, you'll find a community that's predominantly Chinese, or predominantly Vietnamese, or predominantly Spanish speaking. And you say, does it do those people in that community any good not to be able to easily and readily communicate with everybody else in that city? I think the answer to that has to be no. You say, how does it benefit them to be held out and unable to easily communicate with the rest of the community? And if you want to do business with somebody else, if you want to go to work for somebody else, if you want to sell products or services to somebody else or buy them from somebody else, how in the world does it benefit you to live in a country and not have any idea how to easily communicate? Anyway, let me get back to the whales and the dolphins. Consider this. The Biden administration is greenlighting a massive offshore wind farm off the coast of southern New Jersey. This is from Fox News. Despite calls for a pause on the development and a whole bunch of marine mammal deaths that have happened along the Atlantic coast recently. Well, this is what's crazy. Joe Biden is practically owned by the environmental left. It's one of the reasons that he's told our country we can't drill for the oil that we have in abundance in this country. We can't drill for the natural gas that's available in abundance. And he's constantly changing the rules by which the federal government manages the lands it owns. You know, our federal government owns about 1/3 of all the land of the United States. And that shouldn't be. Under the Constitution, the government should own only enough land to be able to have our capital, to be able to have the capitals of the states, to be able to have military facilities. And other than that, all the rest of that land ought to be in private ownership, owned by private individuals or private companies. If anybody can think of a great reason why the federal government should own 1/3 of all the real estate in the United States of America, by all means, call as a naysayer and tell me why. But let me tell you the details on this. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, announced yesterday that it's approving the construction and operations plan for what they call Ocean Wind 1. It's an 1,100 megawatt project. It'll be located 15 miles off the New Jersey coastline. Now, 1,100 megawatts, that's about the size of a single average nuclear power plant, which we ought to be building right now. It'll supply enough power for 380,000 homes. It'll start production, they say, in 2025. The project will be made up of 98 wind turbines spread across a 68,000-acre lease area. That's a lot of space, a lot of ocean. For comparison purposes, 640 acres is a square mile. 6,400 acres is 10 square miles. 64,000 acres would be 100 square miles of the ocean, taken up by 98 wind turbines. They're going to occupy almost 100 square miles. It'll be the third ever and largest ever approved offshore wind development, and that's assuming that over time it actually works out. And that's one of my big concerns, is that you're going to spend all this money. You're going to develop this thing. What's the track record for being able to keep these things operating and operating well and inexpensively? I don't know how they're going to do it, but it's probably going to kill an awful lot of sea life. And I guess Joe Biden's okay with that. And apparently his environmental friends are. Don't you just love it when the pharmacy asks you, would you like the name brand or the generic? It's not always, but many times I say generic, please, because, hey, I like saving money too. Wouldn't it be nice if you had that option with CBD? You know, get high quality CBD without the name brand price. Well, now you can do it. Check out my friends at Generic CBD. At genericcbd.com, they buy direct from the manufacturer. They cut out the middleman and they pass the savings on to you. Each product is made in the USA. It's third-party lab tested for quality and strength. And get this, it contains 0% THC. Try it for 30 days. You'll love it or you get your money back. This stuff is amazing. Remember, genericcbd.com products are not currently sold in stores. So check them out at genericcbd.com. GENERIC, genericcbd.com. Your number one source for generic CBD. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA, and these products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. Pleasure to be with you on a Thursday. Coming up, we'll talk about D.C. focusing on the tasks assigned by the Constitution or trying to do everything for everyone. To the Lars Larson Show, it's a pleasure to be with you on a Conspiracy Theory Thursday. Glad to talk to my friend Seton Motley, the president of a group that we need so much of, and that is less government. The U.S. government often aims big, and then when they miss, they tend to miss big, too. It's they do the opposite of what we do when we're shooting rifles. Aim small, miss small. The government aims big and misses big, and then when they create a problem, they just move along and come back to fix it later sometimes. How are you, Seton?
I'm doing well, sir. How are you?
Not too bad, but is there anything we can do to rein in the federal government and get it back to its assigned duties in the Constitution?
I'm dubious. Look, what you mentioned is exactly what happens because, as we now know, Congress is largely dysfunctional. So the small problems become big problems because the dysfunctional government doesn't do anything about them when they're small, and then they get huge, and then they do these massive, landmark, transformative pieces of legislation, which, as you said, they aim huge and they miss huger. And of course, as we know, I always feel the necessity to mention this. The federal government is supposed to do very, very little. The Constitution gives it very little to do, and then it says the 9th and 10th Amendments, those things not expressly given to the federal government don't belong to the federal government. They belong to the states and the people.
Yep.
So I always feel the necessity to say that. Now, there are some things it's supposed to do, like, for example, the patent system. Now, this is where it gets the worst. The patent system is a part of the Constitution, as you and I have discussed.
Yep.
But what happened is when they're supposed to do something, in the late 2000s, they had a couple years at the patent office where they issued some patents they shouldn't have issued. They were too broad in their approval process. Under that rubric, in the name of fixing that, they decided to fundamentally transform the patent office. Now, this was a small problem that required a small fix. You tighten up the patent approval process. They decided instead to sell out to big tech and big business and make it dramatically easier to steal patents. And that's what I wanted to point out in this piece this week was they do these little small things. They make these small errors And now the only time they go big anymore, it seems, is in service to their big business cronies. And that's what happened here in 2011. And of course, we're now paying the price. And now, of course, 12 years later, they're trying to fix some of the mess they made with the law in 2011. And I say in the piece, why, it was a bad bill. Don't mend it, end it, get rid of it. Just repeal what you did, because what they said in the statement, one of the Republican senator from North Carolina, Tom Tillis, what he said was, this landmark, I think you used the word landmark, this landmark legislation will restore patent eligibility in multiple areas. And I said, it was your stupid law in 2011 that got rid of it. Just repeal the law that you opposed, and all these problems go away.
So why the reluctance, though? I mean, like, all of us make mistakes. I make mistakes. And my producers know,
Right.
I'd rather just say, okay, that was a mistake. We're going to go back and we're going to do it a different way. We like to try things all the time, either technologically or otherwise. Say, let's try it this way. We try it that way. It doesn't work well. Give it up. I remember when Walmart said, we're going to go green, I don't know, about a decade ago or something. And they were about a year into it, and they said, this doesn't work. And to their credit,
Right.
this mammoth bureaucracy that runs, what is it, 1 million employees or something, they said, you know what,
Right.
that was a dumb idea. Let's not do that anymore. Whereas a lot of companies and governments would have said, no, we just have to increase the funding for it or something. And they were smart enough to say, no, knock it off.
Right. That was the first word of my piece was hubris. And the picture I put up was Icarus with his wax wings falling from the sky. They don't want to admit they're wrong. These elected officials, like you said, it was good of Walmart to reverse. And this is just a simple reversal. It's so much easier than trying to tweak what you screwed up, because you don't know what the unintended consequences of the tweaks to the screw up. Why operate within the confines of your error? Just get rid of the error. Repeal the bill and go back to the way it was prior to 2011, when we had the best economy in the world, in large part because we had the best patent system in the world. If it ain't broke, government will surely try to fix it, and they never do it well.
There was this politician I knew a couple of decades ago who's a mayor, and he went back, he was on the Federal Maritime Commission, Frank Ivancy. And he loved funny little German words. And he had one that I've been told by some Germans is not a word, but it's Fingerspitzengefühl. You know how the Germans will have words for things that we don't even have words for, like Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude, yeah.
Yeah. And Fingerspitzengefühl was supposed to mean lightness of touch. And I said, well, what does that mean? He says, well, a guy who drives a race car, he needs to know he can't horse that car around the corners at 200 miles an hour, right? He's got to have the right touch, and the guy riding the horse has to be able to say, if you just yank on the reins all the time, a horse is going to get mad, and you're not going to get where you're going. But if you know just the right amount of pressure to give, the horse will take you right where you want to go. All of those examples, and he used to talk about Fingerspitzengefühl and how he wanted all these government agencies, because he ran a decent-sized city, Portland, and he said, that's what we should do. Do as little as you can that applies the right amount of pressure and no more. And these guys, like the folks you described, the patent office, or Congress, don't seem to know how to do that.
Right. The phrase in D.C. is, and we talk about this with the FCC, we talk about light touch regulation, meaning, no ham-handed, no ham-fisted, don't drop the anvil. The problem is government's a hammer, and when you're a hammer, the world looks like a bunch of nails, and they don't have any kind of subtlety. And government isn't subtle. You can't, whenever we talk about, threading the needle on, this is why I'm opposed to trying to go after hedge fund providers, even though they don't pay any taxes, and they should pay a lot more. The problem is government's a shotgun. It's not a rifle. And if you aim at the hedge fund guys, you also get all the retirees who have all their money in the stock market and are living off the dividends. So government is not a nuanced thing, and it's not going to be a nuanced thing. It can't be a nuanced thing. So trying to get it to thread needles is not a very good idea.
No, it's not. That is Seton Motley. He's the president of the group called Less Government, and we could use less government right now. Pleasure to be with you on a Thursday. I'll get to your phone calls in a bit. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com and tell Alexa to play the Lars Larson Show. Larson Show, it's Conspiracy Theory Thursday, and it's my pleasure to be with you. Glad to get to your phone calls and your emails. I'll get to one I want to mention in just a moment, but I want to get to some calls first. But I want to tell you about something done by a U.S. District Court judge, not one of the highest-ranking federal judges in America, but he gave conservatives something to really celebrate over Independence Day weekend. We'll get to that in a moment. If you want to join the conversation, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And if you happen to be a naysayer, you'll go right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can vote in our Twitter poll. Who do you think is responsible for the cocaine found at the White House? I would say it's Hunter Biden, but we've given you a raft of choices. You can find the question at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and at larslarson.com on the web. Brought to you by AMAC, great conservative group. AARP can't hold a candle to AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. Join the group I joined years ago. It really does offer great benefits, and it's a great conservative group, whereas AARP stands up for everything liberal in America. You can call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better for you and better for America. What better way to start a Conspiracy Theory Thursday hour than talking to a great naysayer? Dan's on the line from Idaho. Hey, Dan, what do you and I disagree about that makes you a naysayer?
Well, Lars, this might be the first time I've ever disagreed with you on something.
Wow.
Except for the subject of the federal government owning lands.
Okay.
That's basically our public land, and is free for everybody to use in most states in most instances, especially sportsmen that get outside for, living in the world. Even if it's state-owned land, the states are obligated to make money with any lands they have, and if they don't, they end up selling it.
Well, that's not always true, Dan, because I know plenty of examples where states do not begin to use the land for everything they could. And I don't mean just putting shopping malls on it. I mean, there are states where they grow timber on lands, and when you compare how they do it versus how private companies do it, the private companies always beat them 6 ways from Sunday. But let me ask you something first. Shouldn't we consider this first? What in the Constitution entitles the federal government to control 1/3 of all the land in the United States?
Yeah, see, I don't know all that information. I'm not as sharp as that as you are, but
But you don't have to be sharp. The Constitution allows the government to own enough land to establish our capital in Washington, D.C., happen to land there instead of Philadelphia or New York, and not much else. Land for military bases and those necessary functions. But nothing in that document gives them the authority to own that land. So I'd first question, well, they do own the land, and you're right, it's held in common for all of us. Do you think the federal government uses that land that it owns on behalf of all of us and puts it to its highest and best use?
They do not put it at their highest and best use. Absolutely not.
Would a private owner do that?
But if a private owner does that, then what's going to happen to all your national forests that we recreate on? And I know you're a hunter yourself. At least
I am.
I believe I've heard that on your show.
I am.
Where would we go to do that?
Okay, I can give you a solution to this problem that solves my problem with the government doing something it's not constitutionally entitled to do. And I don't think we should let the federal government do anything that it's not constitutionally entitled to do. And there is a provision in there to own some land for a capital and for military bases. And other than that, they're not allowed to just be the giant landlord for all of America. But you could do it this way. You could say, we want our government to sell that land to people who want to buy it. And you could insist on a public easement and make it a public easement in perpetuity. So you say a timber company could come in and buy the land, an oil drilling company could buy the land. I mean, any company that wants to buy that land and pay the American taxpayers what it's worth, and let's pay down some debt while we're at it. But there's a public easement for that land that, as long as it's forest, that they have to allow access by the public. It wouldn't be demonstrably different except for a couple of things. Number one, we'd get the money from selling the land. Number two, the companies that own it would have to pay taxes, property taxes or severance taxes in the case of minerals and timber, and they'd have to allow public easement in perpetuity. And so does that solve the problem?
I still don't know if that would or not. I think there's probably some things that would still have to be addressed, like how, some logging companies, if it's a logging company, are they going to be regulated to how much they can take off
they're
the
regulated
land?
to a fairly well.
Do
you know, Dan, this is where I don't expect everybody, I don't know everything about everything, but, the private companies have been required since the 40s that if you want to cut that timber down, you got to replace it. You got to replant it. And most of the private companies that own private timberlands, they replant their trees all day long. And if you're a mining company, there are regulations that say you dig a big hole in the ground, you got to fix it. You got to make not necessarily fill it in, but you've got to make it so that it's not a big eyesore and it doesn't cause runoff and all those problems. And frankly, if you had all that land used to its highest and best purpose, right? Whether it's drilling for oil and natural gas, growing trees, growing food, whatever you do with it, would that also generate jobs, generate economic activities, and generate tax revenues for the rest of us? Because to me, Dan, letting the federal government, which is a bad manager of almost everything it manages, right? The Forest Service used to be a net revenue positive agency. They have 30 or 40,000 employees. They're net revenue negative. And if I said to you, they've got a couple of 100 million acres of trees and they lose money every single year. Could you imagine if a friend of yours told you, Dan, I got 10,000 acres of timberland from my grandpa and I lose money on it every year? Wouldn't you think he was about six kinds of idiot?
Oh, yeah. And I agree that they don't manage anything very well. My biggest concern is losing that public access, which you brought up some great points that I'll have to try to maybe look into a little bit further. My life revolves around hunting
saying,
and whatnot. So
I think private landowners would benefit the public, and frankly, you have to start with the business of whether or not the federal government is even legally entitled to own all that land. And when they own it, then they control what you can do in it. And Dan, right now, the Biden administration, I talked about this yesterday, is trying to change the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, not Black Lives Matter. They want the BLM to lease lands that are fat with potential for oil and natural gas to conservation groups. And do you think those conservation groups, Dan, are going to invite you to go duck hunting or deer hunting on that land?
No, that's the problem, is they're calling them conservation groups, but they're actually preservation groups. Conservation is usable and preservation is not. It's hands off.
You know what? I used to run into this as a reporter. I'd go in and say, I want to see that archive of documents, not anything sexy or anything, but just like an archive that was interesting about a politician. And they say, oh, no, we're preserving it. And I said, so you have a document or a stack of documents and nobody ever sees them? Then what the heck good is it? It's like owning a great-looking painting and locking it up where nobody ever sees it. The federal government is great at that. Private actors, much different. Dan, great naysayer. Thank you very much. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. When people hear the name Gotham, they think about the crime-ridden city patrolled by Batman. But is the real Gotham, New York City, even worse in some ways, or was it, than fiction is? There's a brand new documentary out. It's called Gotham, and its co-producer and director is Michelle Taylor, and she joins me now. The documentary is actually called Gotham, The Fall and Rise of New York. Michelle, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on today, Lars. I look forward to talking about all of the issues that are plaguing both New York City, but a lot of our urban cities today.
Yeah, you're right about that. I mean, I've never made my home in New York. I've visited a number of times, never spent more than, maybe a week there. And it's a fascinating city. And I've always said, it's great to visit. I don't think I'd want to put up with what New Yorkers have to put up with. But some of them seem to take great pride in the fact that the city doesn't beat them. But it's been an interesting city. And your documentary spans, about 50 years, 66 through 2013. and you talk about how it has been transformed. So let's talk about it, about what the documentary shows or depicts.
Yes. The one thing that's really interesting about New York, and Frank Sinatra says, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. But it is actually one of the few American cities that was, in the 70s and 80s, in the depths of despair, the economic devastation, the crime, 2,200 homicides a year, over 500,000 car thefts and crime. It was everything that you imagine. The Bronx was burning, the subway cars just filled with graffiti. But it went from that to what I think is, in 2013, the greatest city in the world. That was not an easy task. That took a lot of time, a lot of effort, and really a lot of guts by political leaders to make the changes that were necessary. And so what New York is actually is a blueprint of how you can do that with our urban cities. Unfortunately, as in most cases, New York didn't follow the guidance that it had for those 20 years under Giuliani and Bloomberg, and has since kind of collapsed within itself. But still to this day, it's actually not as bad as LA or San Francisco or Chicago, primarily because it still does have that legacy that Bloomberg and Giuliani left of decreasing crime, giving the park spaces over to the people, getting people jobs, getting them off of welfare, and improving the education system.
How much of what's wrong with New York, or was wrong with New York and got fixed, was because of the way the government managed the place, both city government and perhaps state and federal as well?
I think it's almost all of it. The unique thing is you have to kind of also realize that when Giuliani became mayor, Clinton was president and Pataki became governor. So you had these forces with Gingrich also at the federal level, all working actually together at a unique moment in history to try to bring both crime and welfare under control. So you had this Democratic president under Clinton, and Giuliani actually went around the country promoting his crime bill at the time. And that really gave funds and resources to New York, because if you remember, it was also not in great fiscal condition. I mean, New York had struggled for years since the 70s trying to get its books in order because it overspent on everything. And the resources that the federal government and the state government gave to the city showed, again, a blueprint of what can be done when you then put the political will of someone like at the time, Giuliani, who said, no, we're not going to put up with this. We are going to criminalize people that are doing bad things and put them in jail. We are no longer going to allow our parks to be safe havens for both criminals and drug users. We are going to get people jobs and get them off of welfare, and we're going to make sure our education system is teaching students. In the 70s, the graduation rate in New York was in the 50s. And by 2013, it was over 75%. I wish it would be higher, but that's still a huge improvement of just at least kids graduating with a high school degree.
I'm talking to Michelle Taylor. She's the co-producer and director of a new documentary, and I love documentaries. I used to make them myself, but this is a good one, Gotham, The Fall and Rise of New York. And the funny thing is, Michelle, I end up using New York as both a good example and a bad example, but I do both of them. Mm-hmm. I mean, some of the best charter school experiments have been done in New York City. Right. And I think they provided the punchiest, kind of evidence that, yes, it can work even with desperately poor people in bad neighborhoods with bad influences, and yet you got Steve Brill and people like that who say, hey, it works right here. If it works here, as you said, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. And then, of course, there are the bad examples as well. The broken windows theory that worked so well when Rudy Giuliani actually put it to work, and then fails when people forget about it and say, oh, we don't need that anymore. Let all this stuff go on.
The one thing that, as I said, pre-Giuliani, the homicide rate in New York was 2,200 a year. So that was a city of about a little over 7 million at the time. During Bloomberg's era, it reached 387 murders of a city of 8.5 million, which is unbelievable. Wow. But that was primarily due to the broken windows philosophy of the little things matter, enforce crime and everything at the local level, fix that broken window, don't let people jump subway turnstiles, enforce people actually paying the bills, following tickets that are, with illegally parked cars. All those things have tremendous output and follow the rest of the city, where you have a respect for law and order. And in the city, like a big American cities, you have to have that, because otherwise it all starts falling apart. It's too big and too unwieldy, and that's what we're seeing today. No enforcement, no respect for law and order, no respect for even just civil society at the local level. And then now I mean, now the cities aren't even the people who live there. They belong to the homeless or to those who are mentally unstable or to the drug users. And that's not, no one wants to live in a city like that.
No, they don't. I'm talking to Michelle Taylor. Her documentary is called Gotham, The Fall and Rise of New York City. And one of the things I always appreciated was when my wife and I would go back there occasionally on visits, we would see some homeless, just people down and out, sleeping on the subway, on the steam grates at night. But we also saw an awful lot of other people who seemed to be, okay, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to sell fake Rolexes. I mean, even that stuff, even though technically not legal and all that. But I thought at least these people have said, I'm going to go to the center of commerce, really for the whole world, and one of the and the biggest city in the country. And instead of just being a beggar, I'm gonna go do something. Even the folks who went and I guess stood in line for people. So the notorious lines where you'd have to go get a city permit or a drive, and they say, well, I'll pay you to stand in line for me. And people would do it. And you say, well, it's the kind of opportunity not even necessary elsewhere, but if it is there and somebody can make money on it, good, go ahead.
It has that inbred capitalism. I think one of the things that shocked me the most about New York, this was probably back in 2018, and my husband and I did an experiment where we walked every street in Manhattan. And It was interesting, and we saw a lot. We got some good workouts. But one of the things is up in kind of past, north of Central Park, up in like the 180s or so, was just every single weekend, young men would come out with what they could and would just set up car washing stations on the side of the street. So they got their hose, they got the soap and water, they set up lawn chairs for people who would just like come in and just wait while their car was washed. They had the vacuum, they brought just everything you kind of needed. I thought it's like what you said, that is so entrepreneurial. And then others would be like, oh, we'll fix your HVAC system, we'll do this. It was kind of just a long line on all these streets on the weekends of being kind of just taking care of themselves in their neighborhood.
Yeah, and see, I admire that as opposed to the person who just begs. But I mean, if you say, yeah, there's an opportunity here that you'll do it, and you saw people, every color, every age, everything, were out there doing those kinds of things instead of and in a place that's tough. I remember standing in line once. My wife went down to Canal Street down there, and I was standing in line to buy a coffee, and I struck a conversation. And I said, what does an average apartment down here cost? And I think it was a young lady who said, about $2,000 a month. I said, how do you afford that? She said, I have 2 roommates. I thought 3. And I said, how big? She said, like 700 square feet. I said, okay, 3 people living in 700 square feet for $2,000. Doesn't sound easy at all. But if you can beat the challenge, everything else a cakewalk.
And like it says, it makes you kind of harder and able to do it anywhere. You have to have that hustle mentality. But, oh boy, the city still does not make it easy, particularly these days with the high taxes, the overregulation of businesses. People are just trying to like start something new. Why you would start something, a restaurant, a business, anything in a city, even New York City these days, when someone's allowed to just to come in and take something off your shelf, if you're a bodega, a smoke shop, or anything like that.
It doesn't.
You can be
doesn't
robbed,
work.
and nothing happens.
Michelle, I wish you well, and I hope you continue from 2013 to maybe 2033. Her documentary is Gotham, The Fall and Rise of New York, and it's a pleasure talking to you, Michelle. Thank you very much. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. We'll talk about chest feeding in just a moment, and if that piques your interest, you're going to want to know what's behind that story, and it's not necessarily very savory, but we'll get to that in a moment. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Let's go to Darren in Michigan. Hey, Darren, welcome to the program. What's on your mind, sir?
Good to speak with you, Lars. Yeah, I love your point about, the government owning so much land, and maybe if we had private individuals, own it and this and that. But the access thing, because as you know, as well as I do, people are stupid. So if I've got oil wells or, lumbering, I'm going to have morons walking around my property.
You will, but can I point something out?
Sure.
Just so people know what we're talking about. Somebody brought up the question of the federal government owning a lot of the land, and the federal government federal and state governments own about 1/3 of all the land in the United States of America. Now, there's some states like Nevada that are 90% federally owned. There are other states like Virginia that are 3 or 4%. And the argument I'm used to hearing is, well, but what about hunting and fishing and recreation? In most communities, you could buy a historic house, all right? But if you buy that historic house, you have to agree a few times a year to let people take tours through the house because it's got history locked up in it, and you buy it knowing that. So if you're a big timber company, because timber is the easiest example, because federal government owns hundreds of millions of acres of trees, which I don't think it has a constitutional authority to own, which is a whole nother question. It's kind of not a deal killer, it's a deal maker. Because if I say, does the government have any authority to even own that land? You say no. Well, then why do we let them own it? Well, because then we'd have to sell it to people or to companies, and they wouldn't do the right thing with it. Well, is the federal government doing the right thing with it? If you sold it to them and said, listen, we want to make sure that public access to this land for fishing, for hunting, for recreation, almost let a sneeze go on you. Sorry about that. And if you did that, well, they wouldn't do the right thing. I always go back to, well, is the federal government doing the right thing with the land that we own? You own part of it. I own part of it, Darren. And in theory, we get to use it. Except that lately, in the last few decades, the government finds all kinds of reasons why the public is not allowed to be on the public's land, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. And I could point to you companies that do, and I don't have a dog in the fight, I don't get money from them, but a company like Weyerhaeuser that has forests, it grows trees, they cut lumber, they make other wood products as well, they're big, and they allow people to go out and hunt on their land. And they do police it. So they say, you go out and leave a bunch of trash on our land, you're not welcome anymore. You go out and start fires on our land, you're not welcome anymore, which is the way any of us would treat it. If you invited somebody to your house and, he tracked mud across your living room, you might say, hey, you keep doing that, you're not going to be welcome in my house anymore. And the same thing applies to somebody's land. When I'm on somebody else's land, I treat it with respect. But does it make any sense that the government would be the biggest single landowner in America?
No, absolutely not. And you're right. Unfortunately, the private owner, if you were to go with that, or even today, that you have to police the people. But that's kind of the state of things here in America nowadays, because nobody has respect for anything.
I'll tell you, my in-laws they don't do it as much as they used to. They like to ride quads, four-wheel vehicles, for people who don't know what a quad is. And because I always have to assume somebody will be out there and doesn't know what a quad is, they like to ride in the forest, and they ride on public lands. And what they usually do in the springtime is when they go out there, oftentimes the trail is blocked with downed limbs and sometimes downed trees. They clean up the trail. And sometimes they'll have a trip where they're out for a ride, but they bring along some big, contractor-sized plastic bags, and they pick up the trash. And they figure, we're using this public land, we ought to leave it looking nice. And so they do. I'm sure the environmentalists don't like them because they ride quads, which are powered by fossil fuels and all that, but we'll save that one for another day. But if you could be respectful toward other people's land, and if you say, well, I like the public lands because I can go out there and nobody polices it. Well, that's not a good idea either, is it? Because that land, again, is owned by you and me, and I want people to treat it with respect. And I also point out to people, do you think that hunting is still an active sport in states like Virginia, where only about 6% of the land is in public hands and the rest of it is privately owned? I think it is. People still hunt and fish in Virginia, and Virginia is a state that has a very low percentage of publicly owned lands.
No, and that's great, And again, you're citing the people that, hey, I appreciate the access. I'm going to clean up. I'm going to leave it cleaner than I found it. Unfortunately, those folks, I think, overall, are few and far between, as opposed to the people that would do, whatever, stick nails in trees.
Well, that's now you're talking about the tree huggers out there. They put the nails in there so when the loggers come along to cut the tree down, they get a chainsaw chain in their face, and that I can't go with that at all. Darren, thanks for the call from Michigan. Let's go to Idaho and talk to Brad. Hey, Brad, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Hi, sir. I would just like to comment about you were talking about Weyerhaeuser. I grew up in Coos Bay, went in the military, got out after 21 years. To go home and hunt my home on Weyerhaeuser, I have to pay $300 just to get in there if you can get in there. And if you go to Texas, which is mostly all private land, you got to find a rancher and pay them to hunt on it. So I don't like the government owning the land, but letting private people own it, I've seen it go south that way too. Like up in McCall in Idaho, they bought a huge section of great hunting land, and you can't hunt there no more because the Texans that come in there and bought all the land, you can't hunt there.
So there's downsides to both approaches. But at that point, Brad, I go back to my original argument, and that is, does the federal government have the authority to own all that land? And if the answer is no, then how do we continue to allow a government that's supposed to serve the people to own land it has no right to own?
And I have to agree with you on that. I do. But I've also seen, and I don't trust private people either, because they want the money and they're going to lock it up and make you pay to hunt on it.
On the other hand, Brad, what happens to the price to go hunting if you took 100 million acres of federal land and you put it in private hands? Anytime you got more supply and the same amount of demand, then the price goes down, right? So put 100 million acres of those lands on. And as I suggested, you could always sell the land with the proviso that there is in perpetuity public access for hunting and fishing and enforcement of the knuckleheads who start fires and leave trash.
Well, I don't like them either, but yeah.
I don't either. I don't like, when you're out somewhere and you see a bunch of trash and you think, what kind of jackass goes out and enjoys all this beautiful land, whether you're hunting or fishing or whatever you're doing, just going for a hike, and some jerk leaves a bunch of trash behind that's ugly. And you say, how do you behave that way at home? Do you do that at your friend's house? Do you bring a bag of trash over to your friend's house? When he invites you for dinner, you probably don't get invited back very often. Thanks for the call, Brad. Back in just a moment. Glad to be with you on a Thursday. Always glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. We got to talk about the Biden IRS whistleblower, and is he being retaliated against? We'll talk about that next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to take your phone calls and your emails. I think it's become just about a full-time job. Most investigative reporters, like the great John Solomon, who you can find at justthenews.com, they get to spread their interests across a vast range of different stories that they investigate. I think Hunter Biden and the Biden crime family have become a full-time occupation for John. Hey, John, welcome back.
Welcome back. Good to be with you. Yeah, you're right. Hunter Biden and the Biden family. It's a global odyssey trying to find all the money and who gave it and what their motives were. And it's taken about a dozen staffers in Congress now working on it full time, and a little bit of my time too.
Well, a little bit, but now finally we're starting to see whistleblowers spill out of the woodwork, aren't we?
We are. Yeah, these first two I think are probably. I think we're going to see a third one come forward soon that may have done something with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I'd keep an eye on that in the next few weeks. And then in addition to whistleblowers, some of the inside family members are beginning to make insiders in the Biden family, people that were business associates and friends. They're starting to come forward. We saw Rob Walker cooperate with the FBI, and that information come out as part of the IRS whistleblower complaint saying, yeah, Joe Biden did attend a meeting with the Chinese. I witnessed it. I was there. So that was a big moment. I think the next guy to watch on the insiders of the Biden family, Devin Archer, a man who was really the primary business partner from 2013 to 2016 with Hunter Biden. I think he could be cooperating as early as the middle of this month. And so whistleblowers and Biden family insiders are going to fill in a lot of the blanks that we've all been pursuing in the answers and questions about the Biden family business dealings.
Hey, John, I want to ask you a detailed question, and that is, there are times that whistleblowers are motivated by just simply, this is the right thing to do. I mean, I've certainly had my share of people who come to me, they're cops or they're lawyers, and they say, hey, this is just wrong. And it makes them so angry that they say, I've got to tell somebody about it so the story goes public, whether it actually gets acted on with an indictment or not. And then there are other people who are doing it because maybe they're facing indictment and they're trying to trade, maybe a few years that they would otherwise spend in federal prison for their testimony. How does the Biden whistleblower crowd shape up that way? Are most of them doing it to try to avoid going to prison or not as long, or are most of them doing it because they just think this is dead wrong and Biden's gotten away with too much?
Yeah, listen, it's hard to generalize, right? Because every person's in a different circumstance. Let's start with Gary Shapley and his deputy or his subordinate, both IRS agents with sterling records of achievement. Just in the last few years, Gary Shapley has recovered billions of dollars of taxpayers from tax cheats. That's for a single agent. That's a lot of money. I mean, and so he's been really successful. We're talking Swiss banks and things like that. He was on the fast track to a promotion, a fast track to a new program they were going to let him supervise, and it only went south after he blew the whistle and got whistleblower protection. So he looks like a guy. He's never practiced partisan politics. He was one of the IRS's best and most trusted. And he doesn't look like he has any acts in this other than he saw a tax defendant who engaged in what he believes was serious tax offenses, and he was chronically being treated differently, from getting lesser charges to having the statute of limitations expire on more serious things, to also agents being told you can't ask questions about Joe Biden, no, you can't interview that subject, so that you can't have those search warrants, even though we're telling you met the probable cause standard for a search warrant. So I think he just was concerned that this was a case that wasn't being treated the way it's supposed to, and that's his sole motivation for coming forward. All my reporting across multiple agencies says that this guy is just a guy that believes that the law should be evenly evenly administered, and he's not seeing that, and that's why he came forward. And it could have been Donald Trump's son. If Donald Trump's son was getting this favor, he'd be the same guy blowing the whistle. That's the take on Gary Shapley and his subordinate. Devin Archer is a person about to go to prison. He's not going to get a reduction in the sentence, but I think he feels spurned by the Biden family that he got convicted and Hunter Biden has not faced any serious consequences. And so that could be a motivation for him to tell the truth. And if he comes forward, I think you'll see that in his testimony. I think he's someone that just knows what went on.
See, and I think there almost ought to be a patsy, exception to say, you understand when somebody says, I'm the one going to prison, I'm the one who lost everything, and the rest of these folks are just skating because they're part of an elite crowd or a special, crowd that gets special treatment. That kind of thing bothers anybody out there.
That's right. Yeah, listen, and I think the dual system of justice, we often talk about it, and the difference between how Trump and Democrats are doing, but within the Biden family structure, there are people who have paid dear prices with prison time and convictions, and those who haven't, and they feel like they got treated differently even within the Democratic family. And I think some of that's going to come out. There's an affidavit that was filed in one of the Hunter Biden business partner cases, and he said, listen, I went to prison, but I got to tell you, we all knew what we were doing. This was an influence peddling scheme of trading on Hunter Biden's name. He felt comfortable saying that because he knew the tactics, but he also knew he was going to prison or being punished for it, and someone else wasn't. And I think that dual system of justice even falls down within the business partners of Hunter Biden. They feel like they got treated more harshly than Hunter Biden and some of the other people. So that could be a motivating factor for them coming forward.
I want to ask you this, John, because I wonder whether Congress should pass a law, because influence peddling itself, if you can prove some of the money ended up back with the public official, it's illegal. But in general, if Hunter Biden just runs around and says, my dad's the vice president, pay me some money, and is that strictly speaking illegal? And should it be illegal?
Well, that is a great question. And when you look at the letters that James Comer has sent when he sent subpoenas, he said, one of my intentions of doing this investigation, that isn't only to help accountability, it's to come up with new legislation to address the sort of schemes that Hunter Biden and his partners seem to have come up with to cash in on the family name. So I do think a legislative solution will be one of the outcomes of this investigation. Will it get through a Democratic Senate before 2024? No chance. Could it become one of the hallmark pieces of a new Congress in 2025? A very good chance, because I think a lot of people now are tired of seeing Congress people do what looks like insider trading, seeing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters cashing in on the family name with real impunity to what they're doing. I think there's enough motivation now to get these a different type of set of laws that address the cracks that Hunter Biden lived in and made millions on.
You know, I'm talking to John Solomon. You can find what he does at justthenews.com. John, that's one of the things I tell people I admire the most about you. When I was a reporter, I told acquaintances that I made who were politicians and such, I said, we're acquaintances, but if there's ever a story about you, I'm going to handle it the same way I'd handle it with anybody else, somebody I don't know, or even somebody I dislike. And they understood that. And there were several occasions where I had to do some tough stories on people I knew as acquaintances or maybe even friends. And I just said, hey, you knew this. You know what I do for a living. Same way a cop would say, hey, I'm a cop. You know, you decide to snort a line of blow in front of me, Hunter, I'm going to have to take you in. And that's what a good cop would do. John Solomon is the good cop, and you find him at justthenews.com. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show.
Can you give any more details on where the Secret Service found the cocaine in the West Wing and how it got there?
So, as you know, this is under the purview of the Secret Service. But one thing that I can share, that I'll share a little bit more information. As you know, the President and the First Lady and their family were not here this weekend, as you all reported on this. And as you also know, that they left on Friday and returned just yesterday.
That is Karine Jean-Pierre, and boy, is she earning her paycheck this week. She's having to explain, but what about the cocaine they found in the West Wing of the White House? And as usual, I've been to the West Wing of the White House on just a couple of occasions. I've been to the rest of the White House maybe a dozen times, but there are places in the White House I've never been, and I'm not talking about the Situation Room. I'm talking about places that are so off limits. Well, guess what Karine Jean-Pierre tried to do in that soundbite? She tried to say, well, the first family was not here. They were off at Camp David for the holiday weekend, and then they came back just yesterday. So in other words, it probably wasn't them. I think almost anybody with a brain right now understands it was Hunter Biden's stash of cocaine that the Secret Service found in the West Wing of the White House, but not just the West Wing. And here's where it gets interesting, because I know one thing. Not just having visited the White House, but if you watch politics over the last 50 years in America, when it comes to scandals, the cover is always worse than the crime. The cover-up always makes it worse. And the Biden crime family, well, they're playing by that same stupid script, trying to cover up for the ne'er-do-well, addicted son of a Joe. And that would be Hunter Biden, because everybody who's gotten anywhere near any kind of mainstream media or off-brand media understands Hunter Biden is a cocaine addict. He also likes prostitutes, although didn't find any prostitutes at the White House. But here's where it gets interesting, because new developments came out just in the last couple of hours. And what it is that the official first story, the story that KJP, Karine Jean-Pierre, was, she had to stand out there at the podium and offer up this story saying, well, it was in a highly trafficked area of the West Wing. Well, first of all, the West Wing is a place that to get into it, there is incredible security, background checks, the whole 9 yards. And if you've got any bags or anything else, you think the airport is tough, the West Wing of the White House is especially tough, and you expect it to be. Now, there are reporters who go in and out. They go to the briefing room. They go to the press areas. Occasionally, they even go into the West Wing of the White House. But here's what happened. The initial reports that came out after the discovery of the cocaine over the Independence Day weekend, and of course, they knew at the White House who everybody was going to assume that cocaine came in with, that it came in with Hunter Biden. It was the most logical explanation. And so far, they don't want to talk about it. So what did they do? They put out an initial report saying it was found in a locker in a West Wing lobby where tour guests sometimes leave their personal belongings, like their bag or their cell phone. The problem is today, NBC News, and I'll give them full credit for this, they broke the news the cocaine was not found in a locker in the West Wing lobby. It was actually discovered by the Secret Service in an area that's between the West Executive Foyer, I've been in there, and a lower level lobby. Never been there. It's one floor below the main West Wing offices. It is the place where occasionally they park the vice president's SUV or his limousine. They park those executive vehicles there. And so Karine Jean-Pierre is out there saying, well, this is a place, has a lot of people going through it, all kinds of people all day long. And I mean, she must be tempted to say, and it's not Hunter. It's not Hunter, because if it's Hunter, I'm going to have to stand out here and be basically beat on like a piñata by the reporters in that room who are going to say, wasn't this Hunter Biden? I mean, just yesterday, Karine Jean-Pierre was asked, well, if you find the person who brought cocaine into the White House, are you going to insist that they be prosecuted? And there's the problem for Hunter, because Hunter just finished pleading guilty to tax crimes, and they were federal crimes, not violations, as some media like CBS says. They were federal tax crimes. And he also pled guilty to a gun crime, where he illegally bought a gun, illegally possessed a gun. And after all, his dad is Joe Biden. He's the guy who's constantly telling us we can't let guns into the hands of criminals and drug addicts. Well, how about your son, Mr. President? So she's out there spinning this story saying, oh, yeah, it was found someplace where they have lots and lots of people. Except now it was found someplace entirely different. And while some in the White House very quickly yesterday predicted we'll never find out who actually brought the blow to the White House, no, now the Secret Service says we are bound and determined we will find it. And the U.S. Secret Service has confirmed the substance found was chemically tested, turns out to be cocaine, brought in by somebody who either works there or had authorization to be there. Now, that could be a tourist, but it probably is Hunter Biden. And Anthony Gigliemi, who's chief of communications for the Secret Service, says, we are going to do our best to identify who may have brought it in. Fact is that I've heard in the last 24 hours from people who say, Lars, I used to work at a casino. Nothing happened in that place without it ending up on camera and on video. And Mr. Gigliani says the place where the drug was found is closed to the public. He says, sometimes during the screening process, people will leave things behind. Somebody left their cocaine behind. Who do you suppose that might be? He says there were very robust screening efforts to identify potential hazards. So now the Joe Biden White House is in the middle of a cover-up. Now, I've heard from people who say, well, this is just supposed to be a distraction from everything else that's happening in the Biden White House. I don't know if you could distract. I mean, we've got about 40 different distractions. We've got a war in Ukraine that's chewing up hundreds of billions of dollars. We've got inflation that's still out of control. We've got gasoline prices that are still high. We've got an economy that may or may not be headed into recession. And of course, you've got criminal investigation of the president's son, and now whistleblowers at the IRS who say we were told not to go anywhere near Joe Biden because some of the investigatory trails from Hunter Biden lead right back to Joe. And they were told, don't go there. Don't investigate that. And now we've got yet another cover-up of yet another crime. And we've got a White House that's trying to deny it and say, no, look the other way. Nothing to see here, folks. I don't think it's going to work. I think they're in trouble at this point. And they understand. And this may be a little bit of a distraction from the fact that Hunter Biden's tax crimes relate directly to the millions and millions of dollars he received from Ukraine and from Beijing, and where he complained in those emails on that laptop. Remember the laptop that the Obama-Biden administration and the FBI and the DOJ said, that's just Russian nonsense. It's Russian misinformation. And then it turned out that was a big fat lie. Like I said, the cover-up always ends up being worse than the crime itself. I mean, maybe Joe Biden should step out to the microphones and say, look, I'm ashamed to admit it, but the guy I've called the smartest guy I know is a drug addict. And he may be the smartest guy I know only because he's figured out how to make millions of dollars off my name. Now, if Joe Biden came out and said maybe you could show a little sympathy toward a dad with an addict son. I mean, there are plenty of dads in America, sad to say, who have addicted sons and daughters. Have a little sympathy for him. But no, I think Biden is going to follow the same old script. Cover up, cover up, cover up, until it's time to kick him to the curb and install cackling Kamala as the president of the United States. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad to get to your phone calls and your emails in a moment at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. I want to tell you something. My view of government, there are people who say, Lars, you hate government. I don't hate government. It is a tool. It is to be used for a purpose, and I don't want a tool bigger for the purpose than what you actually need. So when citizens pay their taxes, and nobody actually likes paying taxes, but you expect to get services in return for the taxes that are charged. Now, that's become less and less true over the last few decades because government has grown like crazy. Government decides it does everything better than the private sector, when I would argue there are very few things that the government needs to be doing for citizens or that the government does well when it does it for citizens. And one of my most common challenges to callers, especially naysayers, and by the way, we do love naysayers, we'll put you right to that other line, is when they say, well, the government ought to do that. And I say, can you tell me anything the government does really, really well? And that usually stumps them. Sometimes they'll say, well, what about the military? They say, well, the military is made up of volunteer citizens who work for below-grade pay to be on call 24/7, 365, to be sent anywhere on the planet that America decides it's necessary to defend our national security or to fight a war and sometimes die. Those are volunteers. Their weapons almost entirely, I don't think there's a single example where the weapons are made by the government. The weapons are made by the private sector. So you've got private sector volunteers paid at below market wages for what they're being asked to do, equipped with private sector equipment, and they go and do what America asks them to do. And we thank them when they come home, and I hope we thank them for the rest of their lives. That's something government does well. Now, give me something else they do well. Do they run Amtrak well? Big loser, $1 billion a year. Postal Service loses about $5 or $10 billion a year. And you can usually point to private sector companies that do it better. But one of the things that you expect is services back. What a lot of big cities have done is accepted we're going to have semi-permanent homeless encampments throughout the cities. And I think what is especially embarrassing, I'm going to give you an example out of Seattle, because here's what's happening. Seattle, like a lot of big cities, has simply accepted that it's going to have thousands and thousands of people living on the streets. And it doesn't matter how long or how loudly the regular tax-paying, hardworking, law-abiding citizens complain about it, the city or the county will say, that's too bad. There's nothing we can do about it. The homeless people are going to stay in your neighborhood, even to the point where I talked about a story yesterday that was done by the NBC affiliate, where they pointed to a woman who's trying to escape one of these homeless, infected neighborhoods. You know, it's just infested with homeless people. And she can't sell her house because she says every time somebody drives up in front of her house, they take a look at the neighborhood. They don't even want to leave their car to look at the house because they're afraid their car or parts of it may be missing when they get back. It's that bad. And again, the government says, we've already got your tax money. We've already collected the money. And now when we don't provide you with services, what are you going to do? Well, in the private sector, if you go to a business to buy a product or a service and they don't deliver, number one, you say, I'm never doing business with you again. Number two, you tell, and I'm going to tell 10 of my friends never to do business with you again because you provide such lousy service. And you walk out the door. But with government, they're the only game in town. If the police and the courts and the cops and the sheriff won't clean up the mess of the homeless, then there's nothing else you can do. And it's virtually impossible to do anything on your own that won't also get you thrown in jail. So consider what's happening now. The All-Star Week, Major League Baseball's All-Star Week is coming to Seattle. And they're expecting about 400,000 people to come to Seattle. And of course, they're going to be on television. They're going to have network news crews up the kazoo. They're going to be there because of Major League Baseball's All-Star Week. And what are they going to see? They're going to see a whole bunch of homeless encampments and people shooting heroin right in public. And they're going to see people defecating on the sidewalk. And they know that the major media, and for good reason, will make great hay out of that. They'll say, hey, nice looking city, except the city looks like a trash dump. It starts to look like a third world country. Now, we used to joke. We used to laugh at countries that did this. When China or Russia or North Korea would say, we're going to clean up a particular section so that when the Olympics comes or some other big event happens, we clear all the riffraff out. Now, we know they're going to come back, but we clear them out long enough for when company comes. In some ways, on a personal level, it might remind you of back when you were in your early 20s and you had your first apartment and it looked like a giant garbage dump. I know that doesn't apply to everybody, but it certainly applied to me from time to time. And then you found out, Oh, my mom and dad are coming to visit. So you take all the garbage in your apartment and you either put it in the garage or you stuff it in a closet or maybe fill large garbage bags with it, and you clean up temporarily for company when company is coming. That's what Seattle is doing right now. The same city and the same county in King County that has said, we can't do anything about the homeless. The fact that they've surrounded your kids' elementary school, the fact that your kids have to walk past drug addicts and drug dealers to be able to get to the elementary school door, we can't do anything about it until Major League Baseball comes to town. And at that point, all of a sudden, Seattle and King County gain for a short time, like some kind of superpower in a Marvel Comics personality, a Marvel Comics character. All of a sudden, you gain the superpower to clear out the homeless. And they're going to make this place look so pretty and so neat. And all the homeless, they'll be just shoved out of sight. Not because I feel sorry for most of the homeless. Most of them are there because of their own drinking and their own drugging, and they can change their circumstances anytime they decide to do it. Most of them don't do it. As Eric Johnson pointed out in that great documentary, Seattle is Dying, those homeless people are mostly there because of drug addictions that they began and that they continue. So what does Seattle do? They say, we're going to clean up temporarily. We're going to shove these people out of sight. Do you know what's happening now that's going to change things just a little bit? The homeless are apparently going to fight back. They're not right. I mean, in some cases, people who fight back are right. In this case, the homeless, the people who are driving these zombie RVs that can barely move, they're not licensed, they're not insured, they're not in good working order, they barely run. You can spot them about a mile away. They're running around handing out leaflets saying, let's fight back. Let's make the city's efforts go for naught. We're gonna refuse to be moved out of the way. I'm not saying they're right. They have no right to occupy that public property, but they're going to do it anyway. And now that the city has decided, I think the average citizens in a city like this should be angry. They should say to their city leaders, to the mayor and the city council and the county commission, they should say, you tell us you can't clean up this city every other day of the year, and all of a sudden you're going to be on national TV for Major League Baseball All-Star Week, and all of a sudden you gain the capability to be able to clean everything up, but only for a week or 10 days, and then you're going to let it go back to third world country status right after that? How dare you? I think citizens should be angry about this. Maybe if they get angry enough, and if they say, if you have the capability to clean these people up for a week when you're on national television, you can clean it up the rest of the year, or you can stop having our taxes. What if you could help turn back the clock and help your dog play like a puppy again, no matter their age? It's Lars, and it sure works for Sir Winston Churchill, my Bernese Mountain Dog. That's why Dr. Marty developed Nature's Blend, because your dog needs a diet full of real cuts of meat, similar to what they'd eat in the wild. Dogs go bonkers for Nature's Blend. When given the choice between Nature's Blend and the giant online retailer's #1 bestseller in dry dog food, a study shows 29 out of 30 dogs choose Nature's Blend first. Tori from Tulsa says, my fur baby is so eager to eat it. Other dog foods I've tried gave my sweet boy issues with allergies. They all went away with Dr. Marty's and Nature's Blend. Give your dog a food they'll love and help support their youthful energy, healthy skin, easy digestion, and a happy full life. For a limited time, claim 54% off Nature's Blend and get a free pack of premium dog treats from Dr. Marty Pets. Go to drmartypets.com/pets or text PETS to 511-511. That's text PETS to 511-511. Study available on request. Message and data rates apply. Glad to be with you on a Conspiracy Theory Thursday. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. If I've got a dog in the fight on this subject, it's the fact that we're on social media. I mean, we've got a presence on Twitter, on Getter, on Truth. We're on Facebook. I don't spend a lot of time myself on Facebook, but we post things there. We're on Instagram. We're on Rumble, on various other things. I don't want the government telling social media companies what to do. I think it's something the government has no business doing as they tell these social media companies to filter information, to filter out what the government, in this case the Biden administration, decides is misinformation. I don't think they know what misinformation is except when they're manufacturing it. So There's been a federal ruling against Joe Biden, and now it sounds like they might even appeal this. A federal judge ruling 2 days ago ordered the Biden administration agencies and top officials not to communicate with social media companies about certain content. That is a big win. Now, the way it's characterized by CNN is a win to GOP states. It's actually a win to American citizens to say, tell the government to stop messing around and deciding what information we get to see and what information we don't. Jessica Maluzhin joins me now. She's with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Jessica, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me about what your view, Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI, what's your view of how this went down and the fact that apparently it sounds like the Biden administration plans to appeal it, saying, no, we want to be able to mess around with the social media companies.
Yeah, they are. They're definitely going to push back. And that process has already begun. But here's what this is and what isn't. This is a really good first step on the walk we all need to take about working this out, right? But I will tell you, it's going to be a difficult walk. Anytime you get into the First Amendment, it seems like it should be really clear-cut, and in some ways it is, because I think it's a principle that resonates so deeply with so many of us. But when you get down to defining what is okay and what is not okay, it's a thorny area, right? And social media is a new thing. Never before have so many Americans, wonderfully so, had so much opportunity to speak, and we want to preserve that. But if you look at the decision from this judge, it kind of shows you what the difficulties are going to be too, right? So what he does is he puts out a big list of all the things that these government agencies and some specific government employees are not allowed to do. And you're like, okay, great. That looks good. You're not allowed to pressure them. You're not allowed to threaten them. You're not allowed to get in touch with them about this or that. But then what he also does is give a list of things that the government still can reach out and say to social media companies. And those things are threats to national security, public safety, and election interference. And then you think, oh, well, you know, how you define those things, right? So if you think about the kind of the most famous example here is the Hunter's laptop.
The laptop from hell, yeah.
Yeah, the laptop from hell. You know, it turns out, we learn later, that Meta was influenced by the FBI to suppress that story. So then you think, well, of course, you know, election interference, that sounds dangerous. We don't want that going on. But then you think, okay, well, I guess that's what the FBI thought they were doing, or at least claimed they thought they were doing. So the point here is we definitely need to figure out a way to keep government out of the business of telling social media companies and threatening them and pressuring them to suppress anyone's speech.
But just talking to them is going to be
careful.
enough, isn't it, Jessica? Because if you've got Section 230 of the Communications Act that shields these companies from lawsuits, I'm subject to defamation suits, invasion of privacy suits in anything I publish, anything I say, or frankly, anything, Jessica, that you say. If you decided to defame your boss, say something you knew was untrue, and it goes on the radio, I get sued for that. You know, Twitter can't be, Facebook or Meta can't be either. So just talking to them is enough. Now, if they call up Facebook and say, hey, somebody's posted the recipe for ricin or the plans for a nuclear bomb, you say, okay, that's easy. Like you said, that's the easy part. How do they get to decide, well, having somebody say something about Hunter Biden's cocaine that he left in the library at the White House is a threat to our election security, so we're going to tell, you know, all the social media companies to stop propagating that piece of information. How do you keep them off? How does that stay off limits?
And that's you've hit exactly what the tricky question is here, right? Because one person's freedom of information impulse is another person's public safety concern. So the courts are going to have to do some work. And that's why I said, you know, this is the beginning of this very important conversation, because I think it's safe to say the pendulum swung way too far to government involvement. And I would hope most people could agree on that.
Well,
and even if you don't right now, wait till the administration flips and it's someone else's and you won't like that. So, you know, but you're right. The threat of we're going to take Section 230 away from you guys. Also, other threats like we're going to go after you social media companies, maybe in an antitrust way. All of those implicit threats make this kind of action unacceptable. But when you're dealing with a big, giant federal government, how do you prove, oh, no, we're just suggesting this to them. We're not pressuring them. all of this stuff is a real gray, murky area, right? And this is what Congress, hopefully through some educational hearings and some discussion, and the courts are going to have to sort through. Where is the bright line between the government can say this, but they can't coerce this, right?
Well,
so defining what speech is what is hard, and defining where that pressure point becomes too much, where those social media companies feel like we might not survive or we'd take a huge hit to our shareholders if we don't cooperate. That's the sticky wicket.
Well, and I got to tell you, Jessica, having read a lot of the Twitter files that Musk caused to be, to be released, it seemed really clear that most of the people who either are the CEOs and the controlling people in social media companies, and an awful lot of the worker bees, folks who wrote code and did all these other things, they're politically to the left. I mean, there are very few conservatives. And so when the FBI came and said, "Hey, that report from the New York Post, we'll get it taken down right away," they were so anxious to do it that we don't even have to worry as much about pressure. All they have to hear is the White House doesn't like that, and they tear it down. Or they were doing it at Twitter. And so do I have a reason to suspect that even if you say we never pressured them, we never threatened them, we never said something bad might happen to Section 230, we just said, hey, we have a concern about that election story, and boom, it disappears, and everybody gets plausible deniability, don't they?
Yeah, no, and you're bringing up a point that the judge, in this decision, I think addresses that in two really interesting ways. One, it shows that there was a lot more resistance by these companies than any of us realized in the cataloging of. There was a big discovery process where all these emails and texts and all this came out. And there was a lot more pushback from these companies. I was surprised. A lot of commenters have been surprised. And then it does get closer to that sort of implicit threat of, this is a nice company you have here. Sure would be a shame if something happened to it. Then you see the fold, right? But the judge goes on to say, by the way, even if these companies would have decided that way anyway, because employees are of the left or whatever, it doesn't matter because the government still shouldn't be doing that. So he does address that. And I think that's so important, right? Because that's the point here, right?
You know what, Jessica?
The point is you shouldn't be able to do that to the left or the right.
No, you shouldn't. And you know what I think the best test would be? I think that social media companies, when they take down something major like the New York Post story, should have to justify it. And the burden should be on them. If you promise to be a platform, that's how you got Section 230 protection, then when you take stuff down, you better be able to defend taking it down. And it's on you. It's not, it's our platform, because you promise to be a platform that's agnostic. If you take stuff down, if you can't justify it, you're done.
I'll do you even one better. How about this idea? A disclosure of every government request to take down. So whenever they get, whenever Elon picks up his phone and it's the FBI, he makes it public that this has been requested. And
I would absolutely love that. That is Jessica Maluzhin. Jessica, I'm going to have to cut it off at that point, but Jessica Maluzhin is with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We love her insights on these things. Does anybody out there really want the social media companies to get their marching orders from the Oval Office or even Capitol Hill? Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And if anyone ever asks me, Lars, have you ever secretly recorded somebody? I would say, yeah, absolutely. I've done it thousands of times. And then you say, but is that legal? And I say, well, it depends on how you do it. If I'm talking to my friend Josh Marquis on the phone, Josh joins us now, former district attorney, an all-around good guy, and I record the phone call that I make with him, as long as I'm calling from inside the state of Oregon, I'm completely legal to record that phone call without telling Josh. No beep on the line, no advance notice, no after notice either. Now, if you do it in person, in general, there's been a statute on the books that says in the state of Oregon, you can't secretly record somebody without their knowledge. Except that now the Ninth Circuit Court, the most overturned court of appeals, federal court of appeals in America, bar none, has said, no, it's actually, that's a violation of the Constitution to tell people they can't record the conversation. So because it involves legal matters, I thought we'd get Josh on the phone, and we are recording you right now, Josh, by the way. But tell me this, is that law unconstitutional? And then I know you want to say a few things about the way this is being covered by the media, because when the original charge was brought against Project Veritas, our friend James O'Keefe and company, who do undercover journalism, that the powers that be in Oregon were thrilled that a right-wing conservative journalist might be charged with the crime of illegally and illicitly recording somebody without their knowledge. And now the Ninth Circuit Court has said, nope, the whole law is unconstitutional, or has it?
That is what they've had, and what's unusual about this decision is that the heading is Project Veritas versus Mike Schmidt and Ellen Rosenblum. So this is a lawsuit actually for declaratory relief brought by James O'Keefe, who used to be associated with Project Veritas,
right. Not anymore.
Against the specific district attorney of Multnomah County in his official capacity and the attorney general. And in this case, the judge, it was a split decision. It's a 3-judge panel of a 29-judge circuit. The one judge, the presiding judge, was a Bush appointee, and the dissenting judge was an Obama appointee. But in this case, essentially what they're saying, I tend to agree with them. The scariest part of the way this law has evolved in Oregon is that essentially, and this is what Ellen Rosenblum is making clear, that it's content-based. In other words, we are going to enforce it against right-wing journalists, but not against left-wing journalists. And one of Veritas's points is, listen, we're trying to do journalism, whether you agree with them or not. I mean, they're trying to cover it. And that one of their points is, if we make it clear that we're recording, say, for Project Veritas or the National Review or the Lars Larson Show, we're likely to be physically assaulted and prevented from doing it. If, on the other hand, we're doing it for the Antifas, do you think for a moment that Mike Schmidt or the Oregon Attorney General's office would be concerned about one of those people doing it? And that's what's really at the heart of this, is that, and this is where I think the court is right, is it shouldn't matter what the content is or what the intention is. If the act essentially of recording is essentially a form of journalism, whether you agree with that journalism or not, then frankly, it doesn't matter whether you don't like the people doing it. Otherwise, you're going into a very scary area where you're essentially saying free speech is fine as long as I agree with that speech.
Okay, but let me ask you something. Should it even matter whether it's journalism? Because I'd like to see this apply to everybody. My argument has always been that the only person who gets hurt by a recording of somebody's words is the person who's lying. And I've used pedestrian examples. If you said, I'm really frustrated that, I don't know, a contractor was supposed to put a roof on my house, and you call the contractor and you say, hey, you promised to have this on by the 1st of July. It's now the 6th of July. The roof isn't done yet, and it's nowhere near done. When can I expect it to be finished? If the roofer says, yeah, I did promise by July 1, I now promise you it'll be done by the 10th, and you record his words. Well, if you ever decide to make it an issue, and a roof might involve thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, he'll say, I never told him that, or I told him that with some qualifiers. And then you say, well, here's the recording of you saying it.
Right.
The only person that hurts is the liar. And as far as I'm concerned,
right.
hurting liars is not a bad thing.
And let me be clear. I mean, journalism has taken on a much broader meaning. Obviously, we don't approve members of the press. And just because the left wing doesn't like O'Keefe or Project Veritas, they are journalists in every other sense. And in fact, one of the questions is, does somebody who runs a blog that 10 people read, are they a journalist? Yes. If you believe in free speech, it's free speech for everybody. And as you say, I mean, the one thing where Rosenblum and Schmidt, and I think this is a really scary argument, is basically saying is, well, we want to protect people from some people who are going to secretly record you. Well, of course, as you point out, secretly record you doing what? If you're doing something really wildly inappropriate or engaging in speech that's either going to result in you being charged with a crime, which is like, let's go burn down the building, or on the other hand, speech that's going to hold you up to disrepute and ridicule, some horrible, terrible, racist or hateful thing directed at somebody because of the color of their skin or what political beliefs they have, then you know what? So be it. And again, as the court observed, Oregon is an extreme outlier, which is ironic because Oregon has always claimed to be a state that cares so much about free speech, but not in this case.
And by the way, one of the examples from Veritas when O'Keefe was still there, They got recordings of people from Planned Parenthood negotiating the price of baby parts, parts of
I've seen the video.
of unborn babies. And they're like, well, we're not talking about buying a Ferrari. Literally, I think, or Lamborghini, but what we need $100 a head or $100 a heart, or, they were negotiating the sale of baby parts, which, as you point out, there's no way to get that kind of journalism done and to expose that kind of evil without secretly recording something.
Let's take that example, Lars. I happen to be generally in favor of Planned Parenthood. I generally disagree with you on this subject. But that doesn't take away from the fact that whether you agree with it or not, a journalist, whether they're Veritas or AP or Reuters, should have the ability to ask those questions. And this is truth finding. And if we basically say truth is only okay if you agree with us, then you really don't believe in the First
And by the
Amendment.
way, that's effectively what the fish wrapper, Therese Bottomley's paper, The Oregonian, Oregon Live, has said. It's what the Attorney General says. It's what Mike Schmidt says, right?
Yes, and that's I went back and read some of the original stories by Hillary Baroud, a reporter for the Oregonian back in 2020, and it's just dripping with contempt and essentially saying, right-wing extremist James O'Keefe, did all these terrible things, and the Attorney General was basically fighting to protect Oregonians from this terrible man. You flip this around for just a moment, and it would be a ludicrous argument.
Last quick question: is the law now dead at this point because of the Ninth Circuit's ruling?
One would hope, but one of the scary things that your listeners should be aware of, particularly in Oregon, is that Ellen Rosenblum, the Attorney General, has made it clear that she's going to try to get a workaround through the Oregon legislature.
Well, and she may get that. That's Josh Markey, the former DA. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.